I sent my husband a goodbye text by mistake while sitting in my car outside a pharmacy with a melting bag of ice on the passenger seat and rain ticking softly against the windshield. It was supposed to go to my sister Leah. I had typed it after one of those mornings when your whole life feels held together by strings so thin you can hear them strain. I wrote, I can't do this anymore. Maybe it's better if I just go. Goodbye. I meant goodbye to the panic, goodbye to the pretending, maybe even goodbye to the version of my marriage I had been defending for too long. But my fingers were shaking, and I hit Daniel's name instead. I realized it 3 seconds too late. Then I froze, because his reply came almost immediately, so fast it felt less like a response and more like a message he had already been waiting to send. If you're finally leaving, do it before 6. Renee has the transfer packet ready. Leave your office keys in the blue drawer and don't warn the staff. The buyers are walking the inn tomorrow, and I told them the ownership issue was already handled. I read it once, then again, then a third time with my breath locked somewhere high in my chest. By the time I looked up, the pharmacy sign in front of me had blurred into a red smear through the rain. I had married Daniel Mercer 11 years earlier in the garden behind Blackwater House, the river and my mother spent half her life rescuing from rot and foreclosure. It was the place where I learned to braid sheets into laundry carts, fold napkins sharp enough to please wedding planners, and tell from the sound of footsteps whether a guest needed coffee or privacy. When my mother died, Blackwater House became mine in a way that felt less like inheritance and more like guardianship. Daniel had seemed to understand that better than anyone. He was patient when I grieved, charming with guests, and endlessly willing to tell me that I did not have to carry everything alone. 2 years after our wedding, he left his job in commercial sales and came to work with me full-time. I told myself it was partnership. I told myself love looked like shared burdens and joined bank accounts and a husband who said, let me handle the ugly parts so you can keep the heart of the place alive. I believed him so completely that somewhere along the way I stopped asking what exactly the ugly parts were. Blackwater House sat on the edge of the Westcott River, 3 stories of weathered cedar, white trim, and long porches that caught sunset like a blessing. Guests came for anniversaries, winter riding retreats, small weddings, and the illusion that life could still be slower somewhere. My mother used to say an inn was just a stage where strangers rented peace for a weekend. After she was gone, I kept hearing that sentence in my head whenever I walked the halls at night checking lamps and deadbolts. I thought preserving the place was preserving her. So when Daniel said we needed restructuring, refinancing, operational streamlining, and a consultant, I listened even when I hated the language. The consultant was his older sister Renee, who dressed every sentence like common sense and had the unnerving habit of touching things as if she were already deciding where they belonged. She arrived 3 years ago after her divorce, claiming she only wanted to help us modernize. Within months, she had opinions about staffing, decor, event pricing, vendor contracts, and my so-called emotional attachment to outdated routines. She said it kindly, always kindly. Daniel repeated her points later in softer words. Together they made me feel sentimental where they were practical, fragile where they were efficient, and old-fashioned where they were strategic. Sitting in that car with rain running down the glass and that one text burning in my hand, I understood something terrible in a single clean stroke. They had been planning around my absence. Not fearing it. Not fighting it. Planning for it. I looked at the bag of ice, suddenly ridiculous beside me. I had driven out because the walk-in cooler compressor was acting up and I was trying to save cream for a bridal brunch. That was the kind of emergency I thought I was managing that day. Meanwhile, my husband was scheduling buyers for a property he had no right to sell and speaking as if my leaving would simply finish paperwork he had already started. I did not cry. That surprised me most. I felt shock, yes, and a rising sickness that tasted metallic, but under it there was something even steadier. A line being drawn. I screenshotted the message, forwarded it to Leah, and typed only 4 words beneath it. Don't call me yet. Then I started the car, turned off the wipers, and drove back to the inn where my husband was waiting at the front desk with my mother's ledger open beside him, smiling like a man who still believed the next move belonged to him. When I walked into the lobby, Daniel looked up from the antique cherry desk my mother had bought from a courthouse auction and gave me that familiar half-smile that used to calm me from across any room. It was one of the things that made what happened next so disorienting. Betrayal never arrives wearing a stranger's face. It arrives carrying your favorite coffee mug, asking whether the plumber ever called back, looking exactly like the person whose name you have attached to safety. "You got the ice?" he asked, glancing toward the bag in my hand. I did. My voice sounded normal. I noticed that immediately and treated it like a tool. "Good," he said. "Renee is upstairs reviewing the wedding invoices. We may need to shift some deposits around before quarter end." He said it casually, but now every casual phrase opened like a trapdoor beneath me. Shift some deposits around. Ownership issue. Transfer packet. Buyers are walking the in tomorrow. I set the ice in the service sink and forced myself to move through the motions of the afternoon the way I always did. I checked the brunch room, reassured a guest whose fireplace remote had failed, and signed for a flower delivery at the side entrance. All the while I was listening. Not for anything dramatic. Drama is noisy. Real schemes prefer the sound of ordinary life. Renee came down at 3 with a tablet tucked under one arm and kissed the air beside my cheek. "You look tired," she said. "You should let Daniel take tomorrow's buyer walkthrough." The word landed between us. Buyer. Singular, unguarded, and spoken as if I already knew. I turned toward her slowly. "Buyer walkthrough?" There was the briefest hitch in her expression, there and gone. "Vendor," she corrected with a laugh too light to be real. "I meant vendor walkthrough." God, my brain is fried. Daniel looked up too fast. He was good at recovery, but only when he knew which version of reality he was protecting. "The landscaping people," he said. "We're finally getting a quote on the back terrace." "Right," I said, smiling faintly. The terrace. For 1 second all three of us stood in the lobby surrounded by polished floorboards, hydrangeas and blue ceramic crocks, and the soft clink of breakfast dishes still being sorted in the kitchen. Then a guest entered through the front doors with 2 children and the moment broke. But the break did not soothe me. It clarified things. They were already slipping. That night, Daniel made pasta and asked whether I wanted wine. I said no, which he barely registered. He spent dinner talking about occupancy trends and event revenue, the language of the interning corporate in his mouth, while I watched the way he never quite met my eyes when money came up. Afterward he took a call on the porch and paced with his back to the dining room windows. I could not hear every word, only fragments. "Tomorrow at 11. No, she won't be a problem. We're closer than you think." When he came back in, he looked almost cheerful. "Do you mind if I use your office printer in the morning?" he asked. "Mine keeps jamming." "Go ahead." "Thanks, Claire." He kissed the top of my head and went upstairs. I waited 10 minutes, then followed, not to confront him, but to check whether he had left his phone charging on the nightstand the way he often did. He had. I stood beside the bed staring at it in the dark, furious at how much my heart was pounding over the simple act of touching my own husband's phone. The lock screen lit easily. He had never changed the code from our anniversary date because he never needed to. I was the trusting one. I opened his messages first. Renee's thread sat near the top, busy and businesslike on the surface. Vendor lists. Timeline reminders. Budget notes. Then farther up, 4 lines from earlier that day. "If she says anything weird, stay calm. The packet is ready. Have her office cleaned out before the Harrisons arrive. Once she's gone, stop over-explaining." I read them twice, then took pictures with my phone so fast my fingers cramped. There was no dramatic declaration, no cartoon villain confession, just enough blunt confidence to strip the lie bare. The Harrisons, whoever they were not landscapers. My office being cleaned out was not operational housekeeping. Once she's gone. I set the phone back exactly where I found it and went downstairs to my mother's old office at the back of the first floor, the room Daniel now called the strategy suite because he enjoyed renaming things until they sounded less sentimental and more profitable. Inside, everything looked untouched. The brass lamp. The river maps on the wall. The cedar chest full of extra blankets. But when I opened the blue drawer of the desk where I kept spare keys and archived contracts, it was nearly empty. My office keys were still there. So was a slim navy folder I had never seen before. Inside were draft documents with sticky tabs, a preliminary asset purchase agreement, and a typed note clipped to the top, Claire transition scenario, version 3. I did not open every page that night. I did not have to. One glance told me enough. They had not merely imagined a future without me. They had rehearsed it. I stood in the room my mother once used to stay up until midnight balancing books by hand and felt the entire in tilt under a truth too large to ignore. Daniel had not replied to a mistaken goodbye text with confusion or fear. He had answered as a man already waiting for permission to erase me. And because of that one careless reply, I finally knew the most important thing of all. If I wanted to save Blackwater House, I would have to stop being his wife before he realized I already had. I slept maybe 2 hours that night, and even that felt less like sleep than temporary unconsciousness. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my husband's text on the screen and that clipped note in the folder, Claire transition scenario, version 3, as if I were not a woman but a staffing inconvenience. At 5:30 I gave up, pulled on jeans and a navy sweater, and took my coffee to the back porch where the river moved under a skin of fog. My mother loved that hour. She used to say Dawn told the truth about any place because nothing was performing yet. The guests were asleep, the flowers had not been freshened, the breakfast tables were still bare, and you could tell whether a business had integrity by how it looked before the day put on makeup. Blackwater House looked tired but honest. I held that thought because I needed something honest. By 7, the kitchen staff had arrived, and the familiar rhythm of prep began, ovens warming, knives tapping boards, the scent of orange zest and bacon drifting down the corridor. I moved through it with unusual quiet, answering questions, checking reservations, pretending the ground under my life had not shifted. Daniel came down at 8 in a pressed shirt and no tie, the outfit he wore when he wanted to look capable but approachable. He kissed my cheek, poured himself coffee, and asked whether I planned to join him for the vendor walkthrough. I might take the morning to catch up on payroll, I said. That would help, he replied too quickly. Honestly, I can handle the rest. There it was again. A man clearing space for my disappearance while calling it efficiency. At 9:15 Leah arrived in the employee lot with a box of muffins she did not need an excuse to bring. My younger sister had my mother's dark eyes and none of her patience. She hugged me once in the pantry and whispered, "You sent me the screenshots," and then vanished. I'm trying very hard not to commit a felony before breakfast. I nearly laughed, which hurt more than crying would have. I need you calm, I said. Can you do calm? For you, maybe. For him, absolutely not. I showed her the photos of Renee's thread and the folder from my office. Her mouth flattened the way it did whenever she was deciding how much truth I could take at once. Claire, she said softly, this didn't start yesterday. I know. No, I think it really didn't start yesterday. I heard something last month at Lydia's fundraiser. Lydia Barnes had been my mother's accountant and remained on retainer for the inn in a reduced advisory role, though Daniel liked to say her methods belonged to another century. Leah continued, Renee was talking near the coat room with some man from Hartford. She said, once the founder's daughter steps aside, the rest gets easy. I thought she meant your workload. I should have told you. I looked at her and felt that peculiar grief of realizing people around you had seen shadows you kept insisting were weather. Tell me everything, I said. We spoke for 15 minutes in the pantry while trays cooled and staff moved outside the door. Nothing Leah heard was definitive enough alone, but put beside the text, the folder, and the message thread, it formed a line. Hartford likely meant investors or buyers. Founder's daughter meant me. Steps aside meant whatever packet Renee had prepared. Before she left, Leah squeezed my wrist and said, "Please don't try to outnice this. You are not in a misunderstanding. You are in a setup." At 10:40, a black SUV pulled into the circular drive. Daniel straightened his cuffs at the desk. Two men and a woman stepped out wearing soft neutral coats and the expression of wealthy people trying to look casual about a property they expect to own soon. The older man carried a leather folio. No rakes. No measuring tape. No landscaping samples. Buyers. Daniel led them through the lobby with the smooth confidence of someone already giving away rooms he did not yet possess. I watched from the breakfast room doorway while pretending to review a floral invoice. He showed them the library, the west porch, the bridal suite, and finally the riverside lawn where my mother once held free summer concerts for the town. At one point the woman looked toward the office corridor and asked something I could not hear. Daniel smiled, angled his body, and answered with a gesture that included the entire first floor. He was selling narrative, not just real estate. Stability. Clean transfer. Minimal complications. Maybe even the impression of a wife already half absent. When the tour ended, Renee emerged from the side hall carrying a binder I recognized from our board meetings. She handed it to the older man. Not landscaping papers. Due diligence. My hand started to shake for the first time since the text, so I put them behind my back and kept standing. Daniel caught sight of me then, and for one heartbeat his expression changed. Not guilt. Not shame. Calculation. He crossed the lobby toward me after the buyers left and said, "You okay?" "Of course. You look pale. Long week." He lowered his voice. "Renee thinks you might need a break, Claire. You've been carrying a lot." I held his gaze. That's thoughtful of her. We're all on the same side. There are sentences that become monstrous only after you learn the translation. I nodded once, because the only advantage I had left was that he still thought he was ahead. But after the SUV disappeared through the front gates, I did something I should have done months earlier. I called Lydia Barnes and asked if she had time to see me privately that afternoon. There was a pause on the line, then her dry, steady voice. "I was wondering when you finally would." By 2 o'clock I was sitting in the back office of her accounting firm with the windows closed, my phone face down, and every piece of evidence spread across her desk. Lydia read Daniel's text first, then the purchase agreement pages, then the screenshots from his phone. She said nothing for nearly 5 minutes. Finally she removed her glasses, set them on the desk, and looked at me with a pity so restrained it almost felt like respect. "Claire," she said, "if these drafts are tied to the operating amendments Daniel asked me to review last quarter, then this isn't just betrayal. It's an attempted displacement. And if you want to stop it, you need a lawyer before sunset." Lydia did not waste time cushioning facts. That was one of the reasons my mother trusted her. She had the kind of mind that could turn sentiment into columns, columns into warnings, and warnings into action before most people finished being offended. She opened a file cabinet, pulled out a thick folder labeled BH Governance, and set it beside the documents I had brought. 3 months ago, she said, tapping the tab with one red polished nail, Daniel asked me to review proposed restructuring language. He framed it as a growth plan. New capital, revised operating authority, optional succession flexibility. I told him any permanent transfer of controlling interest would require your direct approval and outside counsel because your mother's deed restrictions are unusually protective. Protective how? I asked. Your mother was smarter than people gave her credit for. The main property and business were separated into linked entities after your father left. The operations can be managed by officers, but the land, historical designation, and majority voting rights remain anchored to the founder's heir unless that heir signs a very specific transfer under independent legal review. For the first time that day, I felt something close to relief. So he can't just sell it. Not cleanly, Lydia said. But people with ambition and good tailoring rarely start with the clean path. They start by building a record that makes the rightful owner look unstable, absent, or willing to delegate. Then they blur the rest. I thought about every time Daniel had urged me to step back, every warm suggestion that I rest more, travel, let him take the pressure, let Renee streamline the chaos I supposedly created with my attachment to tradition. Not one of those moments had felt openly hostile. That was the genius of it. They were not trying to push me out with force. They were trying to nudge me into disappearing on paper before I ever understood the shape of the exit. Lydia picked up the purchase agreement pages and frowned. The Harrisons are not small buyers, she said. They own a hospitality group. If they're touring already, someone has represented the ownership issue as manageable. Daniel's text said the ownership issue was already handled. Then he's either lying to them, lying to you, or both. Both, I said. The word came out flat, almost calm. Lydia reached for her phone and wrote down a name on a yellow legal pad. You need Evelyn Shaw. Real estate litigation, trust law, unpleasant when required. Tell her I sent you and tell her not to call the inn. Evelyn's office occupied the second floor of a converted brick bank building downtown. By 6, I was sitting across from a woman in her early 60s whose silver hair was pinned so sharply it looked architectural. She listened without interruption while I told her about the mistaken text, the buyer tour, Renee's thread, the folder from my office, Lydia's warnings, and the slow realization that my husband had been constructing an administrative version of abandonment around me. When I finished, Evelyn leaned back and folded her hands. First, she said, I'm sorry. Second, you are not crazy. Third, do not confront him tonight. I nodded, though the thought of going back to the inn and sitting across from Daniel at dinner felt almost surreal. What can we do? I asked. She slid a legal pad toward herself and began writing in small precise blocks. We can file notice of disputed authority, freeze any attempted sale pending verification, notify the Historical Trust Board that no ownership representations are valid without your direct written confirmation, and issue a preservation demand so internal records, emails, and financial communications cannot be destroyed without consequence. Can we stop the buyers? We can stop a closing. A tour is optics. Optics matter, but paperwork matters more. And if he gets me to sign something? She met my eyes. Then we fight over coercion, misrepresentation, and fiduciary abuse. I would rather not fight there. I would rather make sure you sign nothing and gather more. She asked for every screenshot, photo, date, and memory I had. By the end of the meeting, my phone was full of forwarded documents and my inbox held instructions that made my marriage feel suddenly procedural. Screenshot all communications. Do not delete anything. Do not warn either party. Photograph every paper left in common areas. Note times. Note names. Stay courteous. Let them believe the script still belongs to them. Before I left, Evelyn said, there's one more thing. If they've been framing you as emotionally overwhelmed, they may also be building character evidence through staff impressions, guest anecdotes, even concerns about your judgment. Be careful what you say and to whom. I almost laughed. So I need to act stable. No, she said evenly. You need to act unknowable. On the drive back to Blackwater House, darkness pressed softly against the windshield and the river road felt longer than usual. I remembered how my mother used to review banquet orders with a pencil behind one ear, muttering that running in and meant assuming charm could hide a great deal of theft. Smile counts, she would say. That's why you never balance the books while believing anyone's smile. I had not balanced the books in years. Daniel managed accounts, financing relationships, vendor restructuring, and most external reporting. I managed guests, weddings, staff morale, menus, flowers, traditions, and what he liked to call the soul. It sounded generous when he said it. In hindsight, it was a division of power designed to flatter me away from control. When I turned into the inn driveway, the windows on the first floor glowed amber against the dark like a place from an old painting. Guests were checking in. Someone was laughing in the library. The scent of rosemary bread drifted from the kitchen vent. Ordinary life, still going on. I parked, sat for a moment, and looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face seemed unchanged, which felt obscene. I had expected revelation to mark me somehow. But betrayal is private until you decide to make it public. I walked inside to find Daniel arranging wine bottles for a tasting event. He looked up and smiled. "There you are," he said. I was starting to worry. And because I understood now that worry had nothing to do with love and everything to do with logistics, I smiled back and said the most useful lie of my life. "I took your sister's advice. I've been thinking maybe I really do need a break." If Daniel had possessed even a modest instinct for guilt, he might have hesitated after I said it. Instead, his whole body seemed to loosen. Not much. Just enough that I saw the truth in motion. His shoulders dropped a fraction, his jaw unclenched, and the concern in his face became easier, almost warm. "That might be smart," he said. "You've been stretched thin for months." "I know." I let the words come slowly, as if admitting something painful. "I don't want to make any big decisions tonight. I just think maybe I should step back for a week or two." "Of course," he said. No pressure. But pressure was all around us, only now it had the scent of victory for him. Renee appeared from the event room half an hour later with seating charts in one hand and false gentleness in the other. "Daniel said you had a productive afternoon," she said. "That's one word for it. If you need help organizing things while you rest, I can take over some of the back office tasks." "That's generous." "We're family," she replied. Some people weaponize that word by polishing it until you mistake possession for devotion. I spent the next 3 days becoming smaller on purpose. I left the breakfast rush early. I let Daniel field 2 vendor calls I could easily have handled. I told the pastry chef I might take some time away after the Harrison event and asked her to route urgent issues to Daniel. None of it was dramatic enough to arouse suspicion, but together it built exactly the outline they wanted to see. Claire stepping back. Claire overwhelmed. Claire finally accepting that operational leadership should move to steadier hands. Meanwhile, I gathered everything I could. I photographed the sign-in sheet from the Harrison walkthrough and found the full company name, Harrison Vale Leisure Holdings. I copied revised staffing charts from Renee's laptop when she left it open in the boardroom during lunch. I forwarded accounting summaries from the shared desktop that showed deposits being moved into new sub-accounts with labels like transition reserve and owner reclassification. Each discovery made the picture cleaner and uglier. Daniel and Renee were not improvising around my goodbye text. They had already built a process for transferring authority, then interpreted my mistaken message as confirmation that the final obstacle had removed itself. On Friday evening, while guests gathered for a jazz supper on the West Lawn, I found Daniel in my office with 2 stacks of paper laid out carefully on the desk. He looked up, surprised but not alarmed. "I was actually going to come find you," he said. "What's all this?" "Just contingency planning. If you do want to step away for a little while, there are authorizations that would let us keep things running without bothering you every day." He said it with such practiced tenderness that for 1/6 second I understood how the version of me from 6 months earlier might have signed. He tapped the top page. Temporary operating authority. Vendor approvals. Payroll access. Event refunds. Boring stuff. "So boring," I murmured. "Would you mind if I look at them tomorrow?" "I'm tired." "Take all the time you need." Another lie. Time was the one thing he suddenly wanted less of. That night I took photos of every page while he showered. Evelyn called me back at 11 after reviewing them. "Do not sign a single line," she said. "These are broader than they appear." Temporary authority language cross-references a permanent transfer mechanism if combined with the amendment packet Lydia flagged. So 2 harmless-looking forms become a weapon together. Exactly. Paper rarely attacks from the front. The next morning Leah drove in before breakfast with a tote bag full of office supplies to make her presence look innocent. Inside the bag were 2 small audio recorders Evelyn suggested I keep in common rooms where legal in our state. I still vote for arson, Leah muttered while tucking one into the side drawer of the desk in my office. You do not, I said. No, but it comforts me to say it. By noon we had 1 recorder in the office and another inside the sideboard cabinet in the boardroom where Daniel and Renee liked to hold private meetings under the fiction of confidentiality. I felt ridiculous doing it. I also felt awake. The first useful recording came that same evening. Daniel and Renee thought I had gone upstairs with a headache after dinner. Instead I sat in the linen closet off the east hall with headphones plugged into my phone, listening to the live monitor feed from the office recorder. Pages shuffled. A chair creaked. Then Renee said, "She's folding faster than I expected." Daniel gave a low laugh I had never heard before, stripped of charm because he thought no one who mattered was listening. She was always going to fold once leaving sounded like her idea. Don't get sentimental now, Renee said. The Harrisons want clean governance, not a grieving innkeeper drifting in and out when nostalgia hits. I'm aware. Then get the signatures this weekend. If she hesitates, use the health angle. Offer a retreat. Offer privacy. Offer to protect her from stress. She'll take the velvet version if you hand it to her gently enough. There was a pause, then Daniel asked the question that finally killed whatever remained of my marriage in anything but paperwork. And once the sale closes? You give her the settlement you promised, keep the apartment in Boston, and stop acting like this place has a ghost in every hallway. It has one for her, he said quietly. Not for me. I did not cry. I took off the headphones and sat in the dark linen closet with my hand over my mouth, not because I was heartbroken in that moment, but because heartbreak had already narrowed into something cleaner. What I felt was recognition. The inn haunted me because it was memory. It did not haunt him because to him it was inventory. By Sunday morning Evelyn had filed the first of 3 notices protecting the property. Lydia had started tracing the reclassification accounts. And I had a private recording of my husband discussing my future as if he were removing inherited furniture from a room he planned to redecorate. They still believed I was shrinking. They still believed kindness was my weakest habit. What they did not know yet was that I had finally learned the difference between softness and surrender. And by the time they handed me the real packet, I was going to be ready to let them think they had won right up until the moment their hands closed on nothing at all. On Monday morning the inn looked impossibly beautiful, which felt like an insult. Sunlight washed the river silver. The porch ferns lifted in a soft breeze. Guests lingered over coffee and peach scones as if the world had not tilted beneath the front desk. I moved through breakfast service with deliberate slowness, letting staff see me smile, pause, and defer. The performance mattered now. If Daniel and Renee were building a record of a woman gracefully stepping aside, I intended to give them one so polished it would blind them. Around 10, Renee invited me into the boardroom with the bright solemnity of a person staging mercy. A pitcher of cucumber water sat on the table beside 2 pens, a leather folder, and a small vase of white roses clipped from the side garden. My mother used to put white roses in that room for memorial luncheons. Renee probably did not know that. Or maybe she did and simply did not care. I thought we could make this easy, she said. Daniel stood by the window, hands in his pockets, looking grave in the practiced way men look when they are determined to appear compassionate while taking something. Only if you're up for it, he added. I'm up for talking, I said. Renee slid the folder toward me. These are interim authorizations. Nothing permanent. They'll let Daniel handle vendor, payroll, and capital decisions while you rest. There's also a transition framework in case you decide the inn is no longer healthy for you long term. No pressure. Just options. I opened the packet and let my eyes move slowly over words I already knew. Temporary operating authority. Delegated signatory capacity. Continuity planning. Member withdrawal election. Each page had been engineered to look like care and behave like extraction. What if I'm not sure? I asked quietly. Daniel came around the table then and sat beside me, close enough that I could smell cedar soap on his wrists. "Claire," he said, "no one is forcing anything. But you sent me a message the other day. You were clearly at a breaking point." There it was, the first time he chose to expose what he thought I did not realize he knew. I turned to him with perfect stillness. "What message?" He blinked once. "Just once. You said you couldn't do this anymore. That maybe it was better if you just went." And what did you think that meant? For the first time in days, I saw him searching. Not because he doubted himself, but because he was trying to calculate how much of the board he still owned. Renee answered instead. "It meant you were overwhelmed," she said smoothly. "It meant you need relief." "Interesting," I replied. "Because your brother answered as if my leaving would solve a business problem he had already scheduled around." Silence spread through the boardroom so fast it felt physical. Daniel turned toward me slowly. "What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about." I took out my phone, opened the screenshot, and set it between us. "If you're finally leaving, do it before 6. Renee has the transfer packet ready. Leave your office keys in the blue drawer and don't warn the staff. The buyers are walking the inn tomorrow, and I told them the ownership issue was already handled." Daniel stared at the screen. All the color seemed to drain from his face at once, leaving behind not guilt but fury at being caught without preparation. Renee recovered first. "That doesn't prove what you think it proves," she said. "Maybe not by itself." I leaned back slightly. "Good thing it isn't by itself." I should say I did not stage that moment alone. Evelyn was waiting in a car 3 blocks away. Lydia had copies of the accounting anomalies. Leah sat in the cafe across the street with 2 backup drives and instructions to email everything to 3 separate addresses if I texted one word, "now." Because women like me are often taught that courage means standing alone. It does not. Sometimes courage means finally calling witnesses. Daniel stood up too fast, his chair legs scraping the floor. "Claire, if this is some kind of misunderstanding, stop," I said, and something in my voice stopped him. Maybe it was how tired I was. Maybe it was that I no longer sounded available for explanation. "You toured buyers through my mother's inn. You drafted transition scenarios for my removal. You tried to put transfer authority in front of me under the language of rest. You discussed a sale before I approved one. And unless your sister has developed a hobby for fiction, she advised you to use my health as leverage." Renee's expression hardened. "You recorded us?" "I listened," I said. "To the truth, for once." Daniel looked from me to the packet to the windows as though the architecture itself might provide a route back to control. "This is insane," he said. "Everything I did was for the survival of this place." I laughed then, softly, because nothing he could have said would have been more revealing than that sentence. "No," I answered. "Everything you did was for the ownership of this place." He stepped forward. "You're emotional." "And you're late," I said, just as a knock sounded at the boardroom door. It opened, and Evelyn Shaw entered in a charcoal suit carrying a slim file and the kind of stillness that makes liars immediately aware of their pulse. Behind her stood Lydia, and behind Lydia stood the notary Daniel must have arranged for me, now looking deeply interested in leaving. Evelyn set the file on the table and spoke with exquisite politeness. "Good morning. I represent Claire Mercer in all matters concerning Blackwater House, related entities, and any attempted transfer, sale, encumbrance, delegated authority, governance amendment, or withdrawal election. This meeting is now preservation relevant. I suggest everyone choose their next words carefully." Daniel's face changed then, not into remorse, but into the first unmistakable sign that he understood the door had closed behind him. The packet on the table was still open between us, the pens laid out like little silver lies. I looked at them, then at my husband, and realized the strange peace that had been growing in me since the pharmacy parking lot had finally matured into certainty. He had mistaken my tenderness for pliability. He had mistaken my grief for confusion. And worst of all, he had mistaken a goodbye text for permission. What followed was not the explosion people expect when they imagine betrayal revealed. No one threw a glass. No one slapped anyone. There was no operatic confession collapsing into screams. Real power rarely leaves with that much noise. It retreats, recalculates, and if trapped well enough, begins denying what it said 5 minutes earlier. Daniel did exactly that. "I want everyone to calm down," he said, which is what people say when they are the least calm person in the room. Evelyn did not sit. "Mr. Mercer," she replied, "my client has documentary evidence, recorded statements, and witness-supported irregularities concerning attempted governance displacement and unauthorized sale representations." Calm is no longer the central issue. Renee folded her arms. "You're dressing up ordinary operational planning as some conspiracy because Claire had a hard week." Lydia gave her a look so dry it nearly made me smile. Ordinary operational planning does not usually include owner reclassification accounts, concealed buyer tours, or strategic use of health narratives. Daniel turned to me then, leaving the legal language and trying instead for intimacy, for the old channel. "Claire, whatever this looks like, let's talk privately." "No," I said. "Private is how you built it." He flinched, which felt less satisfying than I once imagined it might. Satisfaction is cleaner when you are still in theory. In real life, it arrives mixed with nausea and the sick recognition that a person you loved is now forced to reveal their truest operating self. Evelyn opened her file and slid copies across the table. Notice of disputed authority. Temporary injunction request. Preservation demand. Historical trust notification. Proposed forensic accounting order. "As of 9 this morning," she said, "all parties who received or relied upon material representations regarding the sale or transition of Blackwater House have been notified that Ms. Mercer disputes any claim of delegated authority and denies authorizing a sale process." Renee's face sharpened. "You contacted the buyers?" "We contacted everyone who needed accuracy." "That could kill the deal." Evelyn's expression never moved. There was no deal to kill. Daniel ran a hand through his hair and looked suddenly older, not from grief, but from the weight of a plan collapsing in daylight. "Claire," he said again, "I was trying to protect you. You've been drowning here." "You know you have." "I have been working," I answered. "There's a difference." "You said you wanted out." "I sent the wrong person the wrong text." "You answered as if you had already built my exit strategy." Renee stepped closer to him then, the first crack in her poise. "We should stop talking," she hissed. "Now you understand process," Lydia murmured. The notary quietly slipped from the doorway. No one tried to stop him. That detail pleased me more than it should have. The machine they had assembled required signatures, witnesses, timing, and the smooth choreography of authority. Once one piece walked away, the whole theater looked cheaper. Evelyn asked for the full packet on the table. Renee refused. Evelyn repeated the request and added, "Refusal will be noted." Daniel finally slid the folder toward her. She leafed through it, then looked at me. "This is even broader than the draft you sent Friday." "Because they were getting bolder," I said. Daniel opened his mouth, but I cut across him. "Tell me something honestly, just once. Were you ever going to tell me before the Harrisons made an offer?" He looked at me for a long moment. The answer arrived before the words did. "I was trying to avoid a scene," he said. There it was. Not love. Not regret. Not confusion. Only management. I nodded slowly. "That's what you always thought I was, isn't it? A scene waiting to happen unless handled correctly." He did not answer. He did not need to. Renee did, though not in the way she intended. "Claire, this place cannot survive on sentiment forever." "Maybe not," I said. "But it also doesn't survive greed disguised as competence." By afternoon, the Harrisons had requested a postponement pending clarification, which was polite investor language for we do not enjoy stepping into family fraud. Lydia began tracing the movement of deposits with one of her junior analysts. Evelyn scheduled a formal review of governance documents for Wednesday. And Daniel, suddenly barred from pretending this was still an internal misunderstanding, moved into the apartment above the old carriage house after Evelyn advised it would be cleaner if we separated physical spaces immediately. He acted offended at the suggestion. I found that almost funny. He had been preparing to remove me from my office, my property, and eventually my life, but the carriage house felt to him like an insult. That evening I walked through the inn alone after dinner service. Guests were in the library, a fire was going in the sitting room, and someone had left a scarf over the banister. The place sounded as it always had, low laughter, distant dishware, floorboards settling under 100 quiet histories. For the first time in weeks, I did not feel the inn asking me to defend it. I felt it standing beside me. My mother used to say buildings remember who protects them. I never understood whether she meant that literally or just in the way places gather stories into their walls. Either way, Blackwater House had witnessed everything. My wedding. My grief. Daniel's charm. Renee's soft invasion. My own long habit of yielding expertise to the person who called it burden sharing. Now it had witnessed the beginning of the reversal too. At 8:30, Leah came by with Chinese takeout and a bottle of ginger ale. We sat on the office floor amid stacks of ledgers and legal copies because neither of us had the energy for chairs. "How bad is he taking it?" she asked. Like a man denied access to something he already renamed in his head. "That sounds accurate." She handed me a carton of noodles. "Do you hate him?" I considered it. Not the way I thought I would. "What way did you think?" "I thought hate would feel hot. This feels cold. Like I'm finally standing outside the weather he kept telling me was my fault." Leah looked at me for a long second and squeezed my shoulder. "That's not cold," she said. "That's clear." She was right. Clarity, I was learning, does not always roar. Sometimes it arrives as administrative stamina. Sometimes it looks like copy machines, affidavits, and choosing not to answer when a man who underestimated you starts knocking softly at your door after midnight saying your name as if it still belongs to him. Daniel knocked 3 times that night and each knock sounded gentler than the one before, as if he believed softness might reverse evidence. I did not open the office door. I stood inside with my hand on the lamp switch, listening while he said, "Claire, please. We need to talk without your lawyer, your sister, and half the town in the room." I almost answered, then stopped myself. People like Daniel are skilled at turning conversation into fog. They do not need many lies if they can make you question the shape of the room. So I stayed silent until his footsteps faded down the hall. In the morning he sent a text instead. "I know how this looks." I panicked. Renee pushed too far. "Let me explain over coffee." I forwarded it to Evelyn, then to a new folder I had labeled post-exposure. There was a strange dignity in documentation. Every excuse lost some of its hypnotic power when reduced to timestamped lines on a screen. Wednesday began with lawyers and ended with the board. Blackwater House had never been a corporation in spirit, but because of wedding liability, preservation grants, and expansion financing over the years, it did have a small governing board for certain operational decisions. My mother assembled it like a woman building a lock: the town preservation chair, Lydia, an old family friend named Harold Pierce who owned the marina, and 2 rotating hospitality advisors with no controlling power but plenty of opinions. Daniel had spent years charming them with performance metrics and modernization plans while I distracted myself with menus and staff birthdays. Now every neglected meeting returned like a bill. The board session began at 1 in the library with rain gathering on the windows and the scent of lemon oil in the wood. Evelyn sat beside me. Daniel sat across with a lawyer of his own, a younger man who had the careful expression of someone discovering mid-case that his client omitted several critical facts. Renee was not a board member, but she insisted on attending as a strategic consultant until Harold said, "Strategic to whom?" and asked her to wait outside. If there was any small mercy in that week, It was watching older men who once patted Daniel on the back begin to look at him as if they had finally located the stain. Lydia presented first, walking the board through account movements, authority requests, and the mismatch between what Daniel called transition planning and what the documents actually enabled. Then Evelyn laid out the legal structure, the founder heir protections, and the risk of misrepresentation to third-party buyers. Finally, she played 2 minutes from the office recording, only enough to establish intent. Renee's voice floated into the still room. Use the health angle. Offer a retreat. Offer privacy. She'll take the velvet version if you hand it to her gently enough. Daniel closed his eyes for half a second. Harold did not bother disguising his disgust. Good God, he muttered. Daniel's lawyer asked to respond, and what followed was the predictable choreography of partial retreat. Yes, the language had been overly broad. Yes, there may have been overenthusiasm regarding future investor conversations. Yes, communications could be interpreted uncharitably outside operational context. Uncharitably. I nearly laughed. There are few phrases more revealing than the ones professionals use when plain speech would sound monstrous. When it was Daniel's turn, he looked at the board, then at me. I made mistakes, he said. But every choice I made was to keep Blackwater House viable. Claire has enormous strengths, but she also avoids the financial realities of this place. I was trying to solve problems she didn't want to face. That sentence might once have hurt me more. Now it only confirmed the architecture of his mind. Even in retreat, he needed to frame conquest as stewardship. I asked for permission to speak, though technically I did not need it. Old habits linger. Harold nodded. I built my life here, I said, surprising myself with how steady I sounded. And that was my mistake. I thought living in a place and loving it were enough to protect it. So I let someone else name the realities for me. I let him call control responsibility and call my trust support. I will not do that again. The room stayed silent after that in the useful way silence sometimes does, not empty but aligning. By the end of the session the board voted unanimously to suspend any transfer discussions, remove Daniel from interim financial authority pending review, and appoint Lydia as temporary oversight officer until a full audit concluded. Daniel remained on site only as co-owner by marriage until the divorce filing altered status, but his power was effectively gone by 4 o'clock. He took the news with a thin smile that made him look briefly like the stranger I should have recognized sooner. You've made your point, he told me outside on the side porch while rain tapped the railing. No, I said. I protected my property. The point is just a byproduct. He lowered his voice. You think Leah and those lawyers will keep running this place for you? No, I answered. I think I will. He looked genuinely confused by that, and I realized then how completely he had mistaken my gentleness for incapacity. He believed my warmth was the absence of steel because he had never bothered to learn the difference. The final public turn came sooner than expected. Friday night was the annual Lantern Dinner, a local fundraiser my mother started years ago for the River Restoration Trust. Canceling it would have fed rumors, so Evelyn advised proceeding. Half the town would be there. So would the Preservation Board, several vendors, and, because money enjoys spectacle, the Harrisons too. They had accepted a revised invitation under the pretense of seeing the inn at its best while observing how matters developed. In other words, they wanted to know whether the mess was survivable and who would emerge holding the deed with both hands. Daniel asked whether he should skip the event for appearances. I told him no. I wanted appearances. By sunset, 100 paper lanterns floated from the lower lawn to the water's edge, trembling gold in the dusk. Guests arrived in dark coats and silk scarves. Music drifted from the quartet under the sycamores. I wore my mother's pearl earrings and the navy dress she once called my steady color. If Blackwater House was going to witness an ending, I wanted it dressed in its own history. Daniel stood near the bar greeting donors with the composure of a man clinging to habits because habits still feel like rank. What he did not know was that by the end of the night, Every last person whose opinion he valued would understand exactly what kind of husband, operator, and opportunist he had been. And this time, there would be no private room left to hide it in. The lantern dinner had always been my mother's favorite night of the year because it gathered every version of the inn in one place. Town officials beside honeymooners. Oyster farmers beside donors in Kashmir. Old waitresses who remembered the building before the renovation beside young couples taking photographs under the magnolia tree. My mother believed places proved their worth by who returned to them when nothing was required. As I moved through the lawn that evening greeting guests, thanking sponsors, checking place cards and candle lines, I felt Blackwater House full of witnesses in the best sense. Not spectators. Not gossips. Witnesses. People who had seen me carry trays at 14, manage wedding crises at 24, bury my mother at 36, and keep the doors open through flood years, staff shortages, and one winter when the boiler died during Christmas brunch. Daniel had never understood that kind of history because it could not be monetized quickly. He understood leverage. He understood projections. He understood how to stand near influential people with one hand in a pocket and look as if every good outcome had already chosen him. At 8:20, after the main course was served and the quartet shifted into something softer, Harold tapped a spoon against his glass and announced that before dessert we would hear a few words about the future of the inn and the Restoration Trust. Daniel looked mildly surprised, then pleased. He thought the stage was offering itself. He walked toward the small platform near the lantern arch with exactly the face he used at wedding toasts, grateful, self-effacing, prepared to convert sentiment into approval. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "This place means a great deal to Claire and to all of us who have worked hard to see it evolve." Evolve. There was one of his favorite verbs, always suggesting inevitability while concealing appetite. He continued for another minute, speaking about stewardship, modernization, the need to balance legacy with sustainability. Then he said, "And sometimes protecting something means accepting that leadership must change shape." That was my cue. Harold stepped aside, not toward Daniel but toward me. "Actually," he said into the microphone, "before we speak about the future, there's a matter of the record Claire would like to set straight." A current moved through the lawn. Not panic. Attention. I climbed the platform without rushing. My pulse was loud, but not chaotic. I had expected fear. What I felt was alignment, as if every step of the week had been a hinge bringing me here. Daniel looked at me with the first true uncertainty I had ever seen on his face. Not because he feared emotion. Because he feared disclosure. "Many of you know," I said, "that Blackwater House came to me from my mother, Eleanor Mercer, who believed in and should never lie about what it is. This week I learned how important that rule is beyond hospitality." The lawn had gone completely quiet. I could hear the river and the faint brush of lantern paper in the breeze. "A few days ago," I continued, "I accidentally sent my husband a goodbye text that was never meant for him." His reply made one thing very clear: plans were already in motion to remove me from operational authority, represent this property as available to buyers, and use my exhaustion as a convenient story for why I might step aside. Daniel moved toward the platform. Evelyn, standing near the front table, did not touch him. She only met his eyes. He stopped. I lifted my phone. "I'm not going to read every message, recording, or legal notice tonight. My lawyers and the board have already handled that. But I am going to say this publicly because the inn deserves truth where lies were spoken in its name. No sale of Blackwater House has been authorized. No transfer of my ownership has been granted. Any impression otherwise was false." A murmur swept through the tables, then settled again. I looked toward the Harrisons, who had suddenly become deeply interested in their folded napkins. "As of this afternoon," I said, "the board has suspended transfer discussions, placed financial oversight under independent review, and confirmed that future decisions about this property will be made transparently and lawfully." Daniel found his voice then. "Claire, this is unnecessary." I turned toward him. "No," I said. "Private was unnecessary." Public became required the moment you tried to build my absence into your business plan. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The truth had a cleaner edge than anger ever does. Then I reached into the file Evelyn handed me before dinner and pulled out 2 envelopes. One was addressed to Daniel. The other to Renee, who stood rigid near the terrace doors, her face so carefully composed that from far away she might have looked untouched. Since we're being honest, I said, Daniel has now been formally served with divorce papers and notice of civil claims related to attempted misrepresentation and fiduciary interference. Renee Calder has been served with notice to preserve records and prepare for forensic review. Gasps came then, not many, just enough to mark the line between rumor and event. Daniel did not take the envelope when I first held it out. A process server stepped from the side path and solved the problem for him. I had not planned that part for drama. I had planned it because men like Daniel are most dangerous in the hour between humiliation and paperwork. The server placed the documents in his hand. Daniel stared at them, then at me, and for the first time all week I saw not anger, not strategy, but vacancy. The story he had been telling himself about me had run out of road. I set the microphone back in its stand. Dessert is lemon cake, I said, because my mother always ended difficult nights with practical information. A ripple of startled laughter moved through the lawn, small and human and kind. The quartet, bless them, did not know whether to play, so Harold quietly told them to wait. I stepped down from the platform and into the crowd that had once felt like an audience and now felt like a bridge carrying me out of the life I had been sleepwalking through. People touched my arm, my shoulder, my hand. Not with pity. With recognition. Leah reached me first and whispered, Mom would have loved the lemon cake line. I know, I said. Across the lawn, Daniel stood alone under the lantern arch holding papers he had once assumed would belong to me. Behind him the river kept moving, indifferent to schemes, carrying light downstream in broken gold ribbons. That was the moment I understood the week fully. The mistaken goodbye text had not destroyed my marriage. It had only exposed that the marriage Daniel wanted was one in which I could be managed, translated, and eventually removed from anything he found profitable. What ended that night was not love. Love had ended much earlier, somewhere between the first hidden account and the first conversation where my grief became usable to him. What began that night was something better than revenge, though it wore revenge's silhouette from a distance. It was authorship. My name on the deed. My voice in the record. My hands back on the wheel of the life I almost let other people narrate for me.